PS1, PS2 and PS3 are some of the most successful consoles ever made. Collectively, they have an enormous library of games, many of which are exclusive and still very much worth playing today. If you own any or all of these consoles, you'll know that finding a genuine replacement controller, particularly for the older systems, isn't getting any easier. There's no shortage of third-party options out there, but if you just want a single solution for all three systems, this can be a tall order. That's exactly where the Defender from Retro Fighters comes in. It's a new wireless controller that works with all three systems and a couple of others, and is very much positioned to be the one retro PlayStation controller that you'll ever need. If this sounds too good to be true, well, I'm sorry to say that sadly it is. In many ways, the Defender is an excellent controller that'll suit a lot of people's needs. Unfortunately, even though it's loaded with heaps of great features, a couple of critical missteps hold it back from being the single best way to enjoy your PlayStation back catalogue. Okay, so let's cover the good first. From a features point of view, there isn't much more that you could ask for from a controller. It uses a low latency 2.4 GHz wireless connection that will give you just under 10 meters of range. It works with the PS1, PS2, PS3, PS Classic, the Switch, and PC. It has a 10-hour battery and it can also be used while plugged in via a USB cable. The controller will automatically turn off to save power, but you can turn it off manually by holding down Select and down on the left analog stick. It has a turbo feature that can be mapped to individual buttons, and it has a rumble. It even has a screenshot button for use with the Switch. The build quality is top tier as well. If you're familiar with Retro Fighters' other offerings, this is no different. It's not a heavy controller, but it still manages to feel solid. Most importantly, it feels perfectly balanced, and out of the huge collection of controllers I own, I can confidently say it's one of the most comfortable to hold. Additionally, it has this textured underside, which I suppose is meant to make it more grippy, and it just feels The analog sticks have a nice smooth motion and they snap back to their neutral position as you'd expect. I would have preferred if they were convex, like the sticks on every version of the DualShock, rather than these flat sticks, but that's just my preference. In practice, it doesn't have a huge impact on the experience. The shoulder buttons don't feel like a cheap afterthought, like with so many other third-party controllers. My fingers sit perfectly above them while holding the Defender, which means that I never need to change my grip to reach them. The R1 and L1 make a satisfying click when pressed, and the R2 and L2 have a small amount of resistance which feels just right. The R2 and L2 are also pressure sensitive, which means it's fully compatible with games that use this feature, such as racing games. The buttons on the front feel snappy and responsive. They're beautifully designed too, and just like the shoulder buttons, they have a satisfying click when pressed. The utility buttons that operate things like pairing, turbo, and the home button are all neatly tucked away, so that you're not at risk of mashing them by accident. The turbo function can be set per button and works perfectly. It's incredibly easy to configure, and as far as this type of feature goes, I have zero complaints. The home button works as you'd expect with the PS3, although it doesn't turn the system on. I guess because the dongle needs power to take a signal, and it can't do that if the system is off. I think Retro Fighters have done an outstanding job here at cramming this many buttons on a controller without it feeling like the bridge of the Enterprise to operate. From a features point of view, it's almost identical to a genuine DualShock. The only thing it's missing is 6-axis, which, let's be honest, isn't likely to be a deal breaker for many people. It comes with two dongles, one for use with the PS1 and PS2, and a USB dongle for use with PS3, PC, PS Classic, and the Switch. It's paired with both dongles out of the box, so connecting it couldn't be easier. In the box, you get everything you need: the dongles, a USB charging cable, and obviously the controller. Okay, so far so good. So what's the problem? The problem is that it's not a great controller for every type of game. While the Defender is an excellent pad for a lot of modern titles like first-person shooters, its performance while playing older games and also fighting games leaves a lot to be desired. The Defender has three main problems with its design that make it borderline unusable for some games. For fighting games, for example, it has got to be the worst controller I've used to date. This is not hyperbole, it's hopeless for fighting games. For starters, the R1 and L1 buttons are just way too sensitive. Even the slightest touch counts as a press, and because your fingers rest on them, the likelihood of accidentally pressing them is extremely high. I actually thought my controller was faulty at first because of the number of times I unintentionally pressed them. For first-person shooters, having a hair trigger is great, but for fighting games it can lead to many unforced errors. The only solution I've found is to hold my fingers away from the buttons like this, which is obviously far from ideal. Buttons with more travel distance or a way to adjust the sensitivity are desperately needed here. The front-facing buttons have problems too. They feel nice enough to press, but they're packed really close together, so again, hitting the wrong one is much easier than it should be. I have pretty small hands too, so this problem is likely to be even worse if you have large paws. This can of course be overcome with time and muscle memory, but why retro fighters didn't stick with the well-established layout, which would be familiar to just about everyone, seems like an odd choice. You'd have to imagine that a large percentage of the people interested in this controller have years, if not decades worth of experience with official pads. I think the decision to not leverage that muscle memory and redesign the button layout really hurts the Defender. If you think about some of the best retro controllers for other systems, such as the M30 and the Retrobit for the Mega Drive, link in the description for my review, part of the reason that they're so great is that their D-pad and button layout are either similar or exactly the same as the original controller. The worst problem without question though is the D-pad. The official PS1, PS2 and PS3 controllers don't have fantastic D-pads either, but this thing is an abomination. I don't think I've ever seen a D-pad disappear into the casing like this one does. When pressed down to the right, you lose any sense of where the D-pad is, which makes drag and punch and 360 motions incredibly hard to perform. You basically have to guess where your thumb is on the D-pad, and you end up having to do overly exaggerated movements to make sure that you perform the motion correctly. It's not just bad for fighting games. Any game that makes use of diagonal D-pad motions becomes very frustrating because you can't feel what direction you're pressing half the time. Because of this, I end up pressing down much harder, and as a result, my thumb gets tired quickly. Now, it's totally possible that this problem doesn't exist on every controller. I've seen other reviews that say it's perfectly fine, so maybe there are slight differences between units. If that's true though, then I think the production QA needs revising, because this is not okay. So, do I recommend the Defender? Well, if you mostly play games that use the analog sticks, which is not a small percentage of games across the PS1, 2 and 3, then sure, this is a pretty great controller. As a PS3 controller, I'd actually argue that for a lot of games it's better than a DualShock. If, however, you play a lot of fighting games and or other games that rely heavily on the D-pad for movement, then I'd give it a miss. It's a shame because, D-pad aside, there are many aspects that I think are fantastic. The analog sticks are as good as a genuine pad, it's more comfortable than a genuine pad, and the compatibility is outstanding. I really wanted to love this controller as much as I love the Brawler, which is the N64 controller from Retro Fighters. That's why I backed the Kickstarter for the Defender, and maybe why I set my expectations a little too high. Sadly, the hunt for the perfect all-in-one retro PlayStation pad, at least for me, will have to continue.